Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Gigi Hyland. I'm the Executive Director of the National Credit Union Foundation, and I am so honored to be joined by two incredibly talented ladies who I've had the pleasure of working with and listening to in other conferences. I'm joined by Fiona Greig, who's the Director of Consumer Research at the JP Morgan Chase Institute, and with Leigh Phillips, who is the President, CEO of Savor Life. Welcome, Fiona and Leigh. I'm so glad to be in this panel with you.
Great to be here.
Good to see you. So let me introduce the topic that we're going to talk about today in this short session that we have. And for all of you in our virtual audience, I hope that you are well and that you're enjoying the Inclusiv conference and all of the great content and speakers and ideas that you're discussing today. What a great effort, and so honored at the National Credit Union Foundation to be a partner with Inclusiv on the work around financial well-being. So I think we all know by now that COVID-19 began as a public health crisis, but really quickly was followed by an economic crisis with a drastic impact on households' financial well-being. And public health and household financial data is showing us how these layered crises are disproportionately impacting poor communities and communities of color, underscoring long-standing inequalities, inequities in health access and financial stability. And Fiona and Leigh are going to talk today about their research, the latest research that they have that tells us about how communities and household financial well-being is doing during 2020 and how credit unions can really think about continuing to adapt and respond in the months ahead. So Leigh, I'm going to start with you and start with a question that I'll also pose to Fiona, but Savor Life has been doing an amazing amount of data collection. It always does, but particularly during COVID-19. And a two-part question for you. What is your data showing on how people, especially low-income households, have been managing their money since the start of COVID-19? And what has been surprising about the data to you? So if you want to start with that, please.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks so much, Gigi. It's great to be here with you and Fiona at the Inclusiv virtual conference. And I have a couple of slides to illustrate some of the data points. I'll run through those really quickly, if that's okay with everybody. So on the first slide, just to give a little bit of context about Savor Life and what we do. So Savor Life is a national nonprofit based in San Francisco, but working nationally. And can you go to the next slide, please? And we use technology to help people save money and to build a habit of saving. So some of you may remember our organization under its former name, which was Earn, and been a big part of the IDA and asset building world now for over 20 years. So Savor Life leverages technology to encourage people to start a habit of saving, and it's really focused on the almost half of Americans who struggle with savings. And over the last few years, we've reached over 400,000 members have joined savorlife.org to begin that savings journey. And what's interesting, Gigi, during COVID is that we've actually seen about a 270% increase in membership over the last year. So even though incomes are really low, our population has been incredibly impacted, we're still seeing a great deal of interest in financial stability, financial security. And I also think the need for a trusted source of information and resources during this very difficult and confusing time. So on the next slide, I'll just say a little bit more about our membership. So this is the population that we know has been hardest hit by the pandemic, particularly economically. So the vast majority of our membership are women, about 82%. Mostly don't have college degrees, average incomes around $30,000 a year. And these are women all across the United States who have joined Savor Life over the last few years. So to answer your question specifically around data and what we're seeing, when people join Savor Life, in order to earn rewards and prizes for saving, which is what we do to encourage savings behavior, people link their financial accounts, their savings accounts at their financial institution to Savor Life. So that actually gives us a really good data set and a window to look at what people are experiencing during this time and what the impacts of different policy interventions have really been on helping people stabilize their families. So on the next slide, I just want to start with some context. So on the beginning of the pandemic, and this is kind of continuing, I'll talk a little bit later about what we're really seeing over the last more recent months. But you can see our population extremely hard hit. looking at 55% of people surveyed being completely unemployed or furloughed, and an additional 28% who really have lost income during this period of time. So you're looking at the vast majority of the people who are members of Save Our Life have been economically impacted. One of the other things that has been surprising to us has been the increase in expenses. So for a lot of us who are sheltering, at home, where maybe we're not traveling, we're not eating out. So for some people, they've actually been spending less. But for lower income people, what we're seeing in our data is an increase in basic expenses. So you'll see here a 39% increase in the month's average amount of money spent on food in the earlier months of the pandemic. This is continuing over the last few months. And what's interesting about this point is that it's also true for SNAP recipients. So people who receive supplemental food assistance from the government are still seeing the significant increase in food, largely driven by preparing to shelter in place, having to buy more groceries, and obviously feeding your kids at home every day and losing some of those additional supports. So on the next slide, we'll dive a little bit more into some of the things that we've been seeing. So the stimulus payments, those $1,200 or $500 checks that came from the federal government in April, we do see a significant increase here in people who received those checks and their ability to save $100 more in April 2020 compared to April 2019. So most of our analysis has been comparing people at this moment in time to what they were doing at the same time last year. So again, what you're seeing here is people making sensible decisions, putting money away for the future when they're able to do that, which is good news, and speaks to how people were preparing to get through this very uncertain period of time. What's less good news is that about 30% of our members didn't expect to get stimulus, and mostly that was because of they didn't file taxes typically because their incomes are too low, they haven't filed them yet, or there was a misconception that public benefits recipients were not going to be eligible for that money. And we've seen the same 30% number play out in other research as well. We estimate that the vast majority, probably 100% of our clients, are eligible for stimulus. So this is a big challenge, I think, in overcoming systems, infrastructure, and misinformation. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about schooling. So we did some survey here, given that our population is largely women and mostly mothers, to look at the impact of remote schooling. And so what that's seen again is this kind of two sides of the ledger hit, increasing expenses and reducing income. So about 53% of our members that we surveyed agreed that their household expenses were going to go up, largely because of the cost of food, as I mentioned, but also the cost of technology. So paying for internet, paying for supportive learning equipment so their kids can still go to school. On the other side of that ledger, you're seeing that 7% of members who can't work remotely, what are they going to do with their kids, right? Who's going to teach their kids? Who's going to make sure that they're going to school every day? Who's going to look after young children? So going back to work really wasn't an option for many mothers. We're also seeing that 34% of people who can work from home still think they're going to lose income because of the hours that they're going to have to spend in flexing their schedules to look after their children. So if we can, on the next slide, I'll just talk very briefly about what we're seeing in savings. So this is kind of an interesting slide to look at. So the pink line here is what people are doing in 2020, and the blue line is what people were doing in 2019. So what we're seeing, I think, in positive news is that people are still able to save routinely, and this has really surprised me. Savings hit a high in April. Around 70% of people contributed money to savings during that month, and it's been slowly going down. It's ticked up a little bit in September, so we'll come back to that. But still over 50% of people in our client population are making payments to savings when they can, which is great. But we're also seeing much higher level of withdrawals. So the people, what this chart shows is withdrawals over $100 by month. And you can see from this chart that it dropped a little bit in April. So that's, people putting money into savings when they got stimulus, but it's risen since then and held pretty, consistent between 25 to 30% of people drawing down over $100 a month in savings since the pandemic began. And then you see that start to kind of level off in September. So I would say, these are some of the things that we're seeing. And if you go to the next slide, if we are putting out research updates weekly, they're at our about.saveourlife.org, or you can email us and we'll add you to our mailing list. But we're looking at all sorts of things. But the things I think have been most surprising, or really what we're interested in terms of countering myths about what's happening with working people, is that the option to return to work is not there for many because of remote schooling. The increase in the cost of food and the ability to put food on the table is increasing. But in the, I think, slightly positive news is that we're still seeing people making sensible decisions, trying to keep current with debt and trying to pay down savings. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Leigh. It's fascinating research to show different patterns, obviously during COVID-19. Fiona, I'm going to turn to you with the same two questions in terms of how you at the Institute are looking at the proprietary data of JP Morgan Chase and what that has shown. So what are you seeing, how people are doing, particularly people of low-income households during COVID-19? And then again, what's surprising you as you look at the data that you have? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Gigi. If we can jump into the next slide. So the data that I'm using are all administrative data from the bank. And we think of this, and I'm going to be going through the highlights of a couple of different studies, but in contrast to the population that Leigh was showing you, this is this population spans the income spectrum. So I think that's helpful in allowing us to bring greater contrast to the lives of low-income families versus the lives of middle and high-income families in this work. And with this work, we can obviously see what's going on with income, spending, and savings. And so I'll be talking about what happened to savings in particular, but also what was the impact of unemployment insurance. So on the next slide, I want to first just show you what happened to spending. And of course, right after the national emergency was declared, everybody's spending spiked initially, right? We all stocked up on groceries and things like that, but then spending plummeted for everybody. And since then, spending has been slowly recovering. And it's actually recovered more quickly for low-income families than for high-income families. Now, this is a puzzle because in some ways, right? Because we know that the job losses have been disproportionately felt by low-income families, Black and Hispanic families. And so it's kind of puzzling perhaps that the spending of low-income families has recovered more quickly than that of high-income families. Now, that could be because high-income families spend a larger share of their spend on, non-discretionary stuff, the flights, the restaurants and things, and all of that spending is much more depressed. I think that is part of the story, but the story I'm going to tell through this deck is that is not the main reason. The main reason, if I were to summarize briefly, is that balances and spending of low-income families is being propped up by the CARES Act, by government supports, whereas spending is remaining low for high-income families because of that they're just not spending as much during COVID. If we move on to the next slide, I can show you these trends by pre-COVID industry of employment, and you can see that grocery workers in the purple line, their spending recovered very quickly, and that makes sense. They're still working. Many of them are actually, their hours are surged. But I'll call your attention to the blue line, which is people who are working in the clothing and department stores. Many of these people lost their jobs, and yet we see the spending of their spending recover more quickly than the spending of those, say, in public administration or government or professional services and the like. On the next slide, I'm going to show you what's going on with balances. Now, by income quartile. And in pure, level space, everybody's balances are increasing. They generally increase around tax season, which they did this year too, though some people got their tax refunds, et cetera, in July. But then you see an immediate additional boost around April 15th when the economic impact payments dropped. And indeed, in our samples, roughly 85% of people received their economic impact payment on April 15th. Now, that's going to be an upper bound because we see the directly deposited economic impact payments. We don't see the check payments and things that definitely came later. But you can tell that in aggregate, this is really boosting the savings of families, especially on the right, in terms of the percent increase that we observe in savings especially for low-income families. Now, this is in part just a matter of math, right? A $1,200 increase or a $2,400 check is going to be a larger boost percentage-wise if you have $2,000 before that, as opposed to if you have $4,000 before that. So that isn't, you know, that's partly what's going on here. But it's notable that we've seen this growth, and indeed, you know, we have data through August, and the balances continue to be quite high year over year, to the tune of, you know, 30%. So balances have remained higher. On the next slide, I'll show the balances by industry of employment again. And again, just calling your attention to the purple and the blue lines. Grocery workers balances increased, but you also see, again, focus on that blue line, right? Department and clothing store workers, their balances are increasing on April 15th, but they're increasing from there. And that starts to suggest that actually it's not just the economic impact payments, but it's also the unemployment insurance that's playing a role here in boosting the savings of workers who very clearly lost their job or lost earnings. Okay, on the next slide, so if we just think about these two big programs, neither of these are my charts, they're all public data, but I think the left chart just shows the cumulative Treasury outlays in economic impact payments, unemployment insurance, and SNAP, which was the other way in which you know, additional dollars were sent directly to families. And it just tells us that, you know, EIP really came first, right? Most of it was dispensed by the end of April, certainly by the end of May. Unemployment insurance was, you know, is a recurring payment, but by the end of July, the US government had sent out as much money or more in unemployment insurance as it had in the economic impact payment. So you can think of these two programs as being comparable in size. If anything, UI is now bigger than the EIP. Moreover, unemployment insurance is playing a larger role in our economy than ever before. The chart on the right just shows UI insurance as a share of total income. And in the past recessions, it's only ever barely bumped up against 1% of total income. But as of June, it was 7% of total income. And there are three reasons for that. Number one, very high unemployment rates. Number two, you know, the extra $600. And number three, the expansion of this program through the PUA to contingent, gig, and, you know, and other workers who may not have had the right earning documentation or levels beforehand. So on the next slides, and I don't have too many more, don't worry. I'm just showing you what is the impact of unemployment insurance, first on people's spending. So we observe that the unemployed here are in orange and the employed are in blue. And basically, no surprise, and we're showing what happened to their spending leading up to the first week and after the first week of benefits being received in week 0. And so you can see the spending is dropping precipitously of the unemployed while they're waiting for those benefits to arrive. It's dropping more so than the employed, you know, which everybody's spending was dropping at this time. But as soon as those benefits arrive, their spending increases, and indeed it actually increases above and beyond their own baseline. So in normal times, unemployment insurance replaces about 50–60% of wages. And right now, you know, with the $600, so no longer right now, but you know, under the CARES Act, the benefits were actually, the median benefit recipient was the UI benefits were replacing about 145% of pre-job loss wages. So they were 40 to 55% higher than their pre-job loss wages. So indeed, people were total income for jobless workers was higher under unemployment insurance for many workers than it was when they were working. And you can see that their spending is actually boosted. Okay, on the next slide, another thing to know about this program is it was very costly for families when they experienced delay in those benefits. So for example, right here, what I've done is we've taken the data and found a group of people who all lost their job by April 19th. And then the green group received benefits by the end of March, the blue group received it by the end of April, and the orange group received it by the end of May. And you can see that those families that had to wait longer, the May group in orange, their spending is ticking down with each passing week while they wait for those benefits to arrive. So this teaches us two things. Number one, just how important it was for states to get these funds out quickly. But number two, it also tells us something about the impact of the PUA, right? But for the CARES Act, many gig workers, many unemployed who otherwise weren't eligible for unemployment and benefits would have looked like the orange line. But instead we gave them benefits, right? Everybody in this chart ultimately received benefits, and their spending looked like the prior page probably. Finally, on the next slide, I'm going to show you our most recent release, which is what happened in August. So the CARES Act gave an extra 600 weekly benefit that ended at the end of July. And so we studied, well, what happened to the spending and the savings of jobless workers who are receiving those benefits in July and August. And so the top chart shows that, you know, as I had said before, their spending was quite elevated. It was elevated relative to even the employed in level space. And it was elevated relative to their own baseline, right? This is the blue line on the top chart. But in August, right when that $600 supplement ends, their spending immediately declines. It declines by about 14%. Now, what's going on with their savings? Their savings, here we index their savings level to their savings level in January on the bottom chart. And you can see that everybody's savings is a little bit bumped up in February and March as tax refunds are starting to roll out. It bumps up a lot in April with that stimulus payment, but the savings of the unemployed continue to grow. And indeed, by the end of July, it was roughly double what it had been in March. And so in August, however, they are spending down 2/3 of the buffer that they had built up over the prior 4 months. And so even though their spending dropped by 14%, imagine what it would have dropped by if they hadn't had that savings buffer to draw upon. So all to say, this is a movie we're continuing to watch because, you know, September would be a slightly different story. A lot of states were pushing out the lost wages assistance. And, you know, but even that has run out for most states because it was a finite pot of money. So, you know, I fear that this is kind of a fall in motion, and that for jobless workers, unless they can find a job and the job market improves, you know, we're starting to see harder trade-offs that families are going to have to make between spending, savings, paying down debts, and that sort of thing.
This is such rich data. So Fiona and Leigh, thank you for sharing it. And I know I have tons of questions. There is a question in the chat, so let me deal with that since I know we're starting to run out of time. Let me just go ahead and ask the question that's in the Q&A. The question is, have either one of you measured the impact of COVID-19 on the Latino consumer yet in particular? Have you segregated? So please, Leigh, if you want to start with that, please.
We haven't looked at that specifically. It's definitely on in our plans. It is a data point that we do track race, ethnicity, so it's something that we're planning to look at, but haven't looked at yet.
We've started, and this is a work in progress that I'm speaking from, but in the same way that low-income families saw larger balance growth, we actually see larger balance growth among Latino and Black families than white families, but that's in percentage terms, and that's likely because they had lower balances to begin with. Beyond that, I don't have much more to share, but it is also something that we're looking into.
Thank you for that. Yeah, appreciate it. So sort of taking the combination of your data together, as both of you look into the future for the next 3 months, how are the trends that you're seeing? How should credit unions kind of think of those trends? In other words, what do you anticipate coming over the next several months for consumers' finances based on what you're seeing? Question number one. So again, let's start. Leigh, if you wouldn't mind taking that one first.
I mean, your guess is as good as mine, Gigi, at this point in time. You know, I can share a few thoughts on that. I'll start with some potential good news, but with the caveat that this was analysis that we did for September, and obviously October has looked very different than September, and I think that just really speaks to the volatility and the uncertainty of the times that we live in. So I've also been surveying our members, as I mentioned, around their employment status and their loss of income. We did see a slight decrease in the number of people saying that they were unemployed by about 8%. And interestingly, we actually saw an 8% increase in savings during that same month. So we saw, again, people the savings rate has started to tick up again a little bit compared to where it was. So kind of to Fiona's point, it was on really high in the beginning of the year. Obviously, there was the tax time bump. Luckily, that had happened right before this, the pandemic beginning kind of coincided with tax season. So people did have a little bit more buffer than, say, if this had began in September or later in the year. And then, of course, the stimulus payments happened. And then we've seen this kind of steady decline, increase in withdrawals, and declining numbers of people making contributions to savings consistently. But we did see that tick up in September. Now, of course, we'll have to see what October holds, as obviously the pandemic has increased its impact, and we're seeing some of those more economic impacts happening again. But a couple of other things that we're watching that we are concerned about. Credit card spending is up by about 38% compared to this time last year. So looking at families earning $50,000 or below specifically, we're seeing that happen. And similarly, about 30% of our membership are reporting in surveys that they're relying more on credit cards. And I'd love to hear Fiona's perspective on whether or not that's due to some of the increased spending that we're seeing, that increase in balance. People are, were spending more when they have more to spend, or if it's now that we're seeing in this later period that people need more liquidity, so they're turning to credit and debt when maybe previously they didn't have to do that. The other thing which I think is on everybody's minds, and definitely on ours, is housing instability, housing insecurity. We did a survey recently that found almost 70% of renters are concerned about eviction in the next few months, compared to about 25% of homeowners. So, we're obviously looking at food insecurity and housing insecurity being the big issues that would be, housing in particular, very, very difficult for us to recover from quickly. So that's a couple of other points. I will just, going back to the savings point, briefly say that we are seeing that those declining balances, more people withdrawing more than $100 a month. And we saw that, previously and, throughout the last few months. So when we think about recovery and what it's going to take to help people rebuild their finances, as Fiona mentioned, we're kind of seeing those balances drop and really starting to think about how do we help people rebuild if and when the employment situation does improve.
Thank you, Leigh. Fiona, how are you going to link your data to what Leigh was just saying in terms of what you anticipate coming over the next couple of months, and also the great credit card question that Leigh asked in terms of how people are managing their finances and their liquidity in their household with savings before, but now potentially that's shifting. So please, what are you thinking? What's your thinking for the next couple of months?
Yeah, well, I do think that the savings was boosted by the CARES Act and for low-income families, whereas the savings for high-income families was boosted by a drop in spend. So, if lower spend is what's fueling your savings, that's a pretty sustainable, trend. Like the savings of high-income people will continue to be high. The savings of low-income people, if it was dependent on the CARES Act, well, then that really depends on what's going to happen in the labor market or another round of stimulus. So I do worry that we are at a turning point for low-income families in terms of initially being, really being able to depend on that cash buffer that they had built over the last while, and now needing to make some different choices, right? And so those different choices could be, I'm really going to try and find a job and get back in the labor force, recognizing that the challenges that families that Leigh documents in terms of childcare and are real, or starting to fall behind on debt payments, or increase liquidity through credit cards. I think Leigh, I work in a larger organization where the data takes days to fall through all the pipes, where it seems like she gets to see it on her dashboard every morning. So I haven't seen the September data just yet, nor the October for sure. So she can see into the future more than I can. But there is a lot of forbearance out there. That is another release valve for families. And, you know I'm most concerned about the renter population, but, you know, there's been forbearance on credit cards, auto loans, mortgages. In the mortgage space, only 9% of homeowners have actually tapped into it. And a third of them are actually still making payments, even though they opted into that forbearance. So that's an option out there. Student loan forbearance was administrative. It meant that actually everybody was already opted in. You had to call up and say, no, I really want to make my payments. Right. So, you know, there are additional release valves for families in terms of being able to fall behind on some of those debt payments in a relatively low cost way. But, you know, I really hope that the labor market strengthens, because that seems like the best game in town, given where Congress is right now.
So thank you for that. And I know we have about 4 more minutes. So I'm going to try, we've got 3 questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and I'm going to try to wrap them into one question. So for those of you that have asked, be patient with me. I think the 2 questions that I see here connected are essentially, what should credit unions do? Given this data, what should credit unions be looking to as they start to go into November, December, January? What does that look like? And I think the sub question of that, particularly with credit unions that have a significant amount of low income population as part of their membership, so many assistance programs look at your assets. So having funds over certain limits in the bank account and the credit union account can really negatively impact the help that those folks can get. And do you see that as a national concern? So it's, what can credit unions do, and sort of that policy concern around this disincentive with different programs. So please, if you could try to wrap that up, and then we'll wrap up our conversation. Leigh, go ahead, please.
Oh, Fiona, you go first.
Fiona, I'm sorry.
I definitely agree that the asset limit test is a massive issue. I mean, it's crazy that just because we gave you $1,200 over here, that might disqualify you for Medicaid over there. I mean, it's that's my personal view, but I think it's really time for us to sort of address that head on at a national level. I think, just to name it, I think this is an incredibly confusing time for families financially, right? Every indicator is either way up or way down, right? Savings way up. Some people have been paying down debt. Some people have been, sending more money to family at home. Some people have been, but yet their labor income is way down, but that their UI income is way up, but that it's like, and so just naming that as a time of incredible confusion for families, and how much uncertainty should I consider as I make these choices, right? So I think families feel like they have many, many more choices decisions to make, not choices, decisions, right? Yeah. And so credit unions are, that steady hand, hopefully, in helping people decide, okay, you've got a little bit of extra cash. What is the right way for your family to prepare for the future, for the next 6-12 months, knowing that, this pandemic may continue and right, all the other uncertainties. And so recognizing that credit unions can play that steady hand role in a time that is very confusing. I think it makes perfect sense for families to be very precautionary in their financial choices, and credit unions can also help families prioritize those choices in the most financially beneficial or cost-efficient way. So, for example, okay, great, maybe you have $400 that you want to put towards paying down debt, which is the highest cost debt. Let's pay down that first, right? That kind of like practical advice could be super helpful for families who are trying to, create liquidity for themselves in the future, either by saving or by paying down debt.
Great advice. Leigh, take us home, please. With 1 more minute.
I would completely agree with that. That was it was really the same thoughts. I mean, we're in an incredibly confusing and chaotic time. If and when Congress does pass some new form of relief, that's a whole other set of complicated things for people to navigate. So I think being a trusted source of information is probably the #1 thing that all of us need to do right now. Connecting families to other resources within your community, helping them to interpret, what are often local, state, and federal policies that are out there and programs to help people, and helping people navigate all of that is extremely complicated. Connecting families to other supports. Credit unions are incredibly trusted, and they also often have credit counseling services and coaching services that people can proactively be connected to. And then also just understanding the psychological burden and stress that people are under right now. Nobody's happy right now, right? I mean, like that's kind of the signs of it. Everyone is feeling anxiety and stress. And for people who are economically stressed, worrying about putting food on the table, worrying about paying their rent, reaching out proactively as much as you can to let people know what you can do to help them and how you can navigate this, it's going to really serve everyone better, right? Because the fewer evictions we have, the more food the families have, the better able our kids are to keep learning, the faster we're all going to recover. So I really see this community, focus on community. Let's all do everything we can to help each other out.
Leigh and Fiona, thank you for sharing your data, sharing your thoughts in terms of what's coming and what credit unions can do. I'm pretty sure we could have talked for another hour. I know the slides will be shared and the presentation is obviously recorded. So for those of you listening, you can go back and look at this. And so a sincere thanks to both of you. And I'm going to turn it over now to Pablo to continue with the session. So thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Pablo?
Thank you so much, Gigi and Fiona and Leigh. Really, really important information. And I don't know, just to think about, people making more money under, unemployment insurance than by working. It's not so much to think about the importance of the insurance payment. It's more to think about the need actually of livable wages, right? This is a national disgrace, and it's just horrible. It's a horrible situation. But thank you so much for sharing this amazing perspective and a wake-up call for us to understand that this is affecting so many of our members in our industry. Well, with that, again, thank you for your insight. I have actually a lot of background noise right now, like everybody else. We're working from home, so my neighbor sometimes decides to lawn the, just cut the grass. So in any case, I'm gonna move forward with the next part of this conversation. As I mentioned in the morning, we have been sharing some of these remarks from industry leaders, just sharing their perspective around how they see the industry moving forward. And I would like to introduce now a video that we asked Renee Satiwhite, who's the CEO of the African American Credit Union Coalition, to share with us. So if we can now show that video, I would really appreciate it.
Hello, I'm Renee Satiwhite, President and CEO of the African American Credit Union Coalition, otherwise known as the AACUC. I am proud that Inclusiv is one of our corporate partners. It's commendable how Kathy Mann and her extraordinary team of credit union advocates are a socially conscious organization, an organization that strives to create equitable, innovative, safe, and affordable financial products and services, providing knowledge to meet the needs of the emerging low-income markets, invest in capital and community development credit unions, and advocating on behalf of communities and credit unions. Such great and important work. In this time of turmoil, civil unrest, economic uncertainty, COVID-19, and the relentless images we see in the media, we must take a step back. I am not a scholar, but I am a woman living in the United States of America. I offer the following comments as a citizen of the United States and a credit union advocate. AACUC and Inclusiv are examples of how our nation could learn to be interactive with all races. When you attend an AACUC or an Inclusiv event, you interact with people from many different backgrounds: interns, young professionals under 40, seasoned professionals 44 to 65, elder professionals 66 and older, many different ethnicities and cultures, people who work in trade organizations, credit union vendors, credit union executives, board members, and staff, all coming together to share a non-violent experience. Our organizations are inclusive. We don't just say it, we demonstrate it. AACUC's mission is to increase diversity within the credit union community through advocacy and professional development. That's pretty focused. Seems simple, but it isn't. There are many layers to advocacy and certainly for professional development. ACUC does not try to be all things to all people. However, we do strive to be good stewards, good corporate citizens, and provide a safe space for people of color to express themselves. In addition, we also provide a safe space for people of a lighter hue to also have a safe space to ask hard questions about cultural things they don't understand. It's my belief that while there are atrocities that have continued for well over 400 years, that if people were to get to know one another, see their fellow man or woman as a person, talk about their challenges, struggles, successes, that kind of interaction would break down barriers. I have a personal motto. I am the possibility of people serving other people passionately. There is no other industry that serves people as passionately as the credit union industry. I am convinced now more than ever that the credit union industry can lead this nation in eliminating racial discrimination. Credit union people don't have all the answers, but as practitioners of financial institutions, we have a commodity that everyone needs. Our cooperative principles, credit union motto, not for profit, not for charity, but for service, and the credit union philosophy of people helping people provide the agreed upon tenets to help us eradicate racism. ACUC has created the Commitment to Change, Credit Unions Unite Against Racism initiative. Here is the opportunity for people in the credit union movement to stand together, united against racism, and encouraging equity and equality. We must be intentional in our thoughts and deeds. Simple kindness goes a long way in healing. Let's be kind to one another. Let's create groups to address the social ills that plague our society. Let's be committed to doing what we can, when we can, because we can. I'm Renee Sadie-White, the President and CEO of the African American Credit Union Coalition. Enjoy your conference. Thank you.
Pablo, we can't hear you.
Now, I just have some significant noise on the background. Can you hear me now?
We can, and we also can't hear your background noise, so you're good.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now. Again, I was saying that listening to Renee, it's always something that inspired me personally, but I think that inspires everyone. With Renee and the ACUC, we've had a long relationship. You know, we are partners in so many ways, and we are proud of promoting DEI and helping the industry understand the opportunity here that we have of you know, having a more diverse labor force, but also to be able to meet the needs of minority communities in the country. All right, so we're gonna move on with the next set of breakouts. We have 3 more coming up: inclusive finance, research on credit union growth and relevance, where speakers will be sharing how the community development lending model enables credit unions to perform better, more equitable, and more responsibly than mainstream financial institutions, especially in times of economic uncertainty. The second breakout session is the intersection of compliance and inclusion, where attendees will learn how credit unions can address compliance roadblocks and identify key ways to support your growth objectives. And the third one is bringing down systemic barriers to defeat inequality, where panelists will discuss how credit unions can empower minority communities to withstand the disproportionate impact COVID-19 on them. We will be closing this session very soon. You can proceed back to the conference homepage again to access the links for the breakout sessions and enter those Zoom meetings. I invite you again to go visit the exhibit hall, just connect with our sponsors and exhibitors. And remember to come back at 3:45 Eastern Time. Enjoy the breakout sessions and see you soon. Bye-bye.